Jonathan, your work spans so many different fields that I was curious as to how I'm going to approach this conversation, but I figured I'd filter it into layers. So let's start off with the biggest question. I mean, it's mind body solution, so everyone knows we have to talk about the mind body problem. So your research has shown that introspection can sometimes impair performance or distort experiences. What does this reveal about the reliability of first person reports in consciousness studies? And how might it challenge dominant methods in the field? And I think while we're at it, Jonathan, what is consciousness?
uh, I mean, consciousness is really paradoxical in so many ways, in that it's simultaneously the thing that we know most intimately. It's really all we know is consciousness. All we know is our own consciousness. And yet at the same time, it's also incredibly inscrutable in the sense that we don't know how to directly measure it. We can't say what is conscious or what's not conscious with any degree of certainty. We assume that each other is conscious because we have such similarities, but there's no like special thing that we can say this is consciousness. So is a bee conscious? Is a plant conscious? We don't know. We can speculate, and that's really what we have to recognize, is that so much about consciousness involves speculation, informed speculations. I like the increasingly prevailing definition of consciousness, which is simply experience. It's simply what starts when you wake up, and maybe it may be going on through the night or not. Again, it's very difficult to know exactly if it's a memory thing or if it's a just not present. But so consciousness is basically experience. In Nagel's terms, it's what it's like to, if there's something it's like to be that thing, then it's conscious. Now, with respect to introspection, this is again a very challenging, somewhat paradoxical thing, because as I said, we rely on our experience for so much. And I do think, and my research has shown, that people's self-reports can be a reasonable proxy in at least some situations for what's actually going on. So we know that when people say they're mind wandering, that they are more likely to show a reduction in encoding and all sorts of other clues that their mind really is off task relative to when they say they're on task. At the same time, it is the case that when we find that when people describe experiences, for example, describing a face or a taste or a color, that can interfere with their nonverbal knowledge. We call this verbal overshadowing. And it seems that when you try to put things in words, you can lose some of the information that you are unable to articulate. And I think that is an important constraint. And really, the approach that we've used is to try to triangulate on self-reports. So people provide self-reports, but then you find other types of evidence, such as behavioral measures or physiological measures, neurocognitive measures that help to validate the self-report. So for example, when people report that they're mind wandering while reading, we see differences in their gaze durations. That typically when you're reading, you spend more time on unfamiliar words than familiar words. So there's a relationship between the characteristic of the word and gaze durations. And when people are mind wandering, that relationship is reduced. So suggesting that they're not processing the words in as meaningful a way. So their self-reports of mind wandering are then validated to a significant degree by their eye movements. Now, it's also important to mention, your question was very packed, so I got to go through a couple of things. It's important to mention also that even in the case of mind wandering, people's self-reports can be distorted. So for example, in some very elegant research, they gave people feedback about their performance on a task and then asked them whether or not they were mind wandering. And the key thing is sometimes they gave them bogus feedback that they either had performed well or not. And if they gave them bogus feedback that they had performed badly, they were more likely to report mind wandering, even though this happened after the fact. So they just inferred from the fact that they'd done badly that they must have been mind wandering. So even something as seemingly transparent as whether or not your mind was focused on the task or not and self-reports are an imperfect measure of even that. Although they're highly related, they're not perfect. So pulling that all together, what this suggests then is that introspection and self-reports are an important source of understanding consciousness, but they're also limited. There's measurement error associated with them. And under some circumstances, people can be truly off. But at the final thing I'll say is that at the end of the day, it's our conscious experience that we have to rely on, even for, looking at the outcome of objective measures. Everything is filtered through our consciousness, and that's just sort of the bottom line.
Yeah, I mean, since introspection is both essential and potentially unreliable, as you just said, how can we build robust science when it comes to consciousness that neither overprivileges nor dismisses subjective experience? I mean, your lab does this in terms of practical strategies. Could you perhaps run through some of them and what you guys do and how you do it and why you do it?
So typically what we like to do is to find converging sources of evidence for the self-reports. And mind wandering has really been the primary area in which we've explored this. So mind wandering, again, is a situation in which you're engaging in some task, say reading, and you realize at some moment that your mind is not, and everyone has this experience, you realize at some moment that your mind is not focusing on the words, your eyes are moving across the page, but you're thinking about something entirely different. And so when people report that they're mind wandering, how confident can we be that the content of their mind really has shifted? And there are a number of different techniques that we've used. As I mentioned before, we've looked at eye movement patterns. We've also looked at reaction time. So you see that when if people are advancing text or doing other tasks, another classic example is you have to press a button every time you see a number, except for the number 3, in which case you have to withhold the button. So if you press the button when there's a 3, that suggests that you were mind wandering. So we can look at that behavioral response, but it could be something else. You could just have not been able to stop your finger in time. So it's not a perfect measure. But what we do see is that when people are mind wandering, there's greater reaction time variability. That is, the rate at which they're pressing the button varies more than when they're on task. So that's another behavioral measure. You can look at EEG and you see increased alpha when people are mind wandering. You can look at what's known as evoked response potentials, where you look at lock it to a particular event and then see what the various different parameters are, say, to the appearance of a stimulus. And we see particular changes in very different brain patterns associated with the object, a reduction in something called the P300. We also can look at fMRI and look at activation of different brain regions. And when people are mind wandering, they're more likely to show activation of a region known as the default mode network, which is a region which is especially active when you aren't giving people a task to do or when they're thinking about themselves. And so all these different measures, when they align with people's self-reports, that helps to validate that those reports are accurate. And then finally, if you ask people to self-report, and if that changes their behavior in systematic ways, then that suggests that the self-report, particularly if it distorts their behavior, as I mentioned with verbal overshadowing of when people are thinking out loud and they do less well on an insight task, or they're less good at recognizing a face or a taste, that suggests that the verbalization was not entirely coherent with the whatever their experience was. That said, we do find that this verbal overshadowing effect, that the disruption that comes from verbalization, tends to be a relatively small effect. It seems to, if it degrades performance, it degrades it only very slightly. And in many situations, thinking out loud is a pretty good representation of the kinds of thoughts that people are having, because a lot of the thoughts that people have, at least many people, are verbal in nature.
I think it's intriguing because there's so many ways someone could interpret this. If you take an illusionist, for example, who interprets this information, it's very easy to then formulate an illusionist theory of consciousness. But you come to a very different conclusion, and your theory of consciousness is very fascinating. I enjoyed reading it so much, and I'm excited to actually dive into this. Before we begin discussing the nested observer windows, etc., firstly, let's start off with: do you view consciousness as something we directly access, or most like a post hoc narrative we construct? How does this tie into your work on meta awareness?
Yeah, it's really both. Let's talk about meta awareness, because that helps to articulate my view about this. Oftentimes, when people talk about consciousness, they talk about two levels. They talk about unconscious processes and conscious processes. And that distinction, I think, is spot on. There's a lot of things that are simply going on below the threshold of awareness, and other things that we're fundamentally experiencing. But I think it's important to recognize a third level. And this third level is basically just a content of consciousness, which is our explicit awareness of what's going on in our minds. And a perfect example of this, or sort of the canonical example, is what I mentioned before: mind wandering while reading. The interesting thing is that almost all of us appreciate that you can't think about something completely unrelated to what you're reading and simultaneously attend to the text that you're reading. And yet routinely, we catch ourselves doing this. And the question is, why do we so often wander away from what we're reading when we know we're not able to do that? Why don't we either stop reading or stop mind wandering? And the answer, we believe, and our evidence is consistent with this, is that people are not aware of the fact that they've mind wandered. They haven't noticed that their mind has drifted away. And then there's that moment where you snap and you go, oh my gosh, I've done it again. I was just mind wandering. It's almost like waking up, but it's really a moment of gaining meta awareness. So this is an example of understanding where your mind is when you hadn't before. And the idea is that we only periodically check in and take stock of what's going on in our mind. And that meta awareness, when we do check in, that is a re-representation of our conscious experience to ourselves. So we're going, oh, I was just mind wandering. But maybe we're right about that, but sometimes we can be wrong. And I refer to that as a translation dissociation, where in the process of re-representing the experience to ourselves, we may come to distort it or misrepresent it in some significant way. So returning to your question, I think it to the degree that we're just having an experience, that experience just is what it is, and we are directly having that experience. But when we try to describe that experience to ourselves or to somebody else, we're now re-representing it, and that's where there's the possibility of distortion. So that's why I said both are true. We have direct access to our experience, but our capacity to describe that experience, to communicate it both to others and even to ourselves, is a re-representation, and that's where distortions can come in.
It's difficult to sort of understand. Well, for someone who's not sure, let's try and rethink this in perhaps a different way. It's kind of like when someone comes out of a near-death experience, let's say, and the common argument is, did they really experience that, or was it just a memory, a recreation of the memory of what happened after. Is that similar to what you're talking about?
Yeah, that would be another example where they presumably they may well have had a real experience when that happened, but all that they have access to afterwards is the memory of that, and that memory could be distorted. Now, it's interesting that many people who have those experiences refer to them as realer than real, and it causes them to question as much the nature of this reality as it does that one. And for the individual, William James, as I'm sure you know, spent a lot of time focusing on this. For the individual who has these experiences, they are entitled to use that as evidence for their metaphysical presumptions, but we shouldn't be expected to hold it with the same degree of validity that they do. And I think it's appropriate for them to question, really deeply whether or not the experience truly was as it seems. Now, there's this example of the idea that maybe the memory, we don't actually have the experience, we just have the memory afterwards, is very similar, or really in many senses identical to Daniel Dennett's cassette theory of dreams. And in his cassette theory of dreams, this is, of course, back at the time when we had, cassette recorders. The idea was that you don't actually have an experience while you're dreaming. What happens is that when you wake up, there's this sort of brain activity, which is like the equivalent of a cassette. You pop it in there and then recreate an experience that never actually happened in the first place. And that theory actually, I think, has been dismissed in rather powerful ways, because when people are engaged in lucid dreaming, they're able to signal while they're actually dreaming. So the rapid eye movement is happening, and they're able to actually show all of the evidence that they're engaging in dreaming while still being able to signal to the outside world, which, since it's happening contemporaneously with the dream, indicates that they're actually having an experience during the dream, and it's not just retrospective. So in the case of
Jonathan, how do they do that? Well, how do they signal while in the
usually it's with their eyes. They move their eyes up, down, left, right. And the eye is the only part of the body that's not paralyzed when people are dreaming, which, of course, is very good, because otherwise we'd be moving our arms and legs, and it would be quite a challenge.
I'm trying to think about it from an evolutionary perspective. Let's say I'm in the jungle, I'm sort of trying to hunt for food, and I'm trying to do something, and then mind wandering occurs. What would be the evolutionary advantage of this? Like, what am I either gaining or losing from doing this? Like, what is really going on here?
Sure. Well, when you're hunting, oftentimes it's going to be problematic if you're mind wandering. If you're not paying attention to the tiger that might be sneaking up on you while you're, chasing after the mastodon.
To be fair, I think picking hunting as an example wasn't the best choice. I mean, because at that
Right.
point, I'm probably
Well, we
going
can
to
do it.
wander the least.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But even there, if you're hunting and you haven't seen any prey in a long time, it's maybe time to start just engaging in planning and thinking about where else might you go. And you might just be there for a very long time, stalking your prey, and you might be feeling like you're up in a tree and you're feeling pretty safe, and you don't have a lot of to do there other than just sort of waiting for some prey to go by. So maybe this is a time to think about how you might redecorate your cave. There might be so basically we have all this capacity, and sometimes we're using it for the task at hand, but oftentimes there's just not much to do. We just have to wait. And if you're in a waiting situation, then there may be real value to mind wandering. So when the surgeon is operating on you, it's really not a good time for him to be mind wandering. But while he's riding the bus home, this might be a good time to think about some alternative way that he could have, or she could have done the surgery.
Well, okay. So we've spoken about mind wandering. We've spoken about a little bit of the meta awareness part. Let's go to your lab, Meta Lab. Could you explain what it
Mhm.
is? I mean, I know, of course, it's memory, emotion, thought, awareness at UCSB, but how is let's talk about how its focus on mind wandering and metacognition has shaped your views now on consciousness, and perhaps go into what the
Yeah.
book is.
Yeah. So it's both memory, emotion, thought, and awareness, and also the idea of meta, which is sort of the step back, looking at the thing itself from a sort of big picture perspective. And that definitely is a sort of a thread that happens in various different aspects. So we've also been interested in meta science, the science of science, and a meta perspective, the idea that you can have multiple different perspectives on things, and really sort of trying to look at the big picture, which of course brings us to thinking about the big issues about what consciousness is and how it relates to physical reality. So because we have this big picture perspective, we tend to look at a lot of different aspects of the mind. We tend to sort of look at how we are actually experiencing those things. So our awareness of our emotions and so on. And I would say that it's really been sort of an interaction between the nature of my mind and what we study sort of in a reciprocal way. They say that research is me search, and it certainly is the case that I tend to be a mind wanderer. My mind wanders sort of all over the place, and it's maybe not surprising that my research does the same. And I tend to step back and look at the big picture, and so it's not surprising that the research does. But because as you engage, the more sort of you engage in the wandering, the more it takes place, the more you step back and ask big picture questions, the more I find myself doing that. And so this reciprocality between my thinking and the people who naturally are attracted to joining my lab and these processes plays itself out again and again.
And I think at this point, all that work, when people within this sphere, I mean, we're both obsessed with consciousness, trying to understand this phenomenon that is that is becoming very, very popular at this point. Because even, I mean, this podcast alone, when I started, it wasn't really a big thing, but suddenly it's been growing and growing. And I think it's because people have this desire to figure out exactly what this is. Because I believe that theories of consciousness have a lot of philosophical slash ethical implications as well. So if you're a materialist, fundamentally you have certain views. Okay, like consciousness ends here. That means you should cut the tree. It means nothing. It means that. So there's a lot of these, and it just so happens that idealism and panpsychism have better meanings within the word themselves. For example, an idealist versus a materialist outside of the consciousness world. There's all these play on words that have these deeper meanings. And at this point, when you look at your life and the way you perceive consciousness, how would you philosophically describe yourself?
Well, so I have this motto of entertaining without endorsing. And so I see a lot of the different perspectives as defensible. And I'm open to pretty much to many different views. I will say that illusionism, that's the one that I have the hardest difficulty with. I spoke with Michael Graziano once, and he did move me from being absolutely impossible to giving it the remotest possibility. So illusionism is the idea that conscious experience itself is an illusion, much the same way that people think free will is an illusion. It seems like we're having phenomenal experience, but that's just confusing a representation with the reality of things. And to me, that doesn't make sense because even the illusion of consciousness is an experience. And so in that sense, it's very hard for me to get my head around that. But um, I get that we are capable of incredible illusion. So that one is the one I feel is the most unlikely.
Yeah. You look, to be fair,
But
I mean, Michael does a great job with his work, with his attention schema theory to highlight exactly how we fall into these traps. I mean,
mhm.
instead of calling it an illusion, he calls it a caricature. We don't necessarily fall for an illusion, but rather we craft this caricature of reality that's what we believe it is.
Well, that I'm more open to in the sense that I think it's very likely that our experience of reality is a construction which distorts and uh, uh, creates a particular lens by which we experience things. And if a bee is uh, conscious, which I happen to think it is, it may very well have a very, very different uh, experience of reality in all sorts of ways. But returning to sort of my basic ontology, I think it's defensible for materialists to argue that we are nothing but a pack of neurons, that the mind is exclusively material in a fundamental way. I think that's defensible. I think it's defensible personally. I think dualism is. I understand the ghosts in the machine problem, but I think there may be ways to solve it, and all the different approaches have really a fundamental problem. So I think the idea that there's sort of two different realms, the physical realm and the conscious realm, and they sort of interface in important ways. I think that that monism, that there's some sort of other substrate neutral monism, that there's some other substrate which is neither material or conscious, which is sort of the fundamental foundation of consciousness, or excuse me, of reality. And I also think that idealism, that this is all just consciousness, is plausible. And panpsychism, which is the idea that there's sort of consciousness which is built onto larger consciousnesses and built onto larger consciousnesses, that actually is probably the approach that I find myself most resonant with. And we can get into the nested observer window model, which builds on that idea, on the general resonance theory. But what I don't think is what I disagree with is what is really sort of the primary view of science at the moment, which is material reductionism is the exclusively defensible ontology, and all the others are superstitious and don't warrant consideration. That's a view that I think is short-sighted, and I think that there are multiple different ontologies that are consistent with the scientific endeavor.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think that just like you, I mean, it is the mark of an educated mind to entertain an idea without accepting it, and that's primarily what this podcast is about: exploring all these ideas, putting yourself in the shoes of everyone, trying to figure it out. I mean, I remember a time where I would not even consider a non-brain theory of consciousness, and that was just many years ago. But so I know exactly what you mean, and at this point, I've made it a mission and goal to actually embody a lot of these other theories, and it becomes quite so plausible to a point where you start to question your own theory of consciousness. And right now, as I always say this on the show, but I'm super agnostic at this point. I have no idea what consciousness is, which is great because it makes
Yeah,
hosting this podcast so much more fun, because then I get to dive
sure.
into theories like yours. But you've laid out a little bit of the groundwork for this. Talk to me about the nested observer windows. Are we going to call it the now model, or what do you prefer to call it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I love at the risk of being self-congratulatory. I love the acronym now, because one of the conjectures of the now model is that each window may be nowing, having its own now, right? That we are a constellation of windows, all of nested observer windows, each one having its own phenomenal experiencing, nowing at its own particular rate. Some the passage of time happening in different rates for different windows.
Yeah,
Okay,
I love that.
so
one more thing before you go on there. Sorry, Jonathan.
yeah,
Did you make meta as well? Was that your idea for the?
yeah, yeah. Well, let's see. I think I came up with meta, and then Johnny Smallwood, my longtime collaborator, who tragically passed away just a few months ago. So a shout out to him and his family. He came up with the memory, emotion, thought, and awareness.
You guys are coming
But
up with some
yeah,
amazing
we
acronyms.
knew we wanted it to be meta.
Okay, well, let's get into it. So now,
Yeah,
let's
yeah.
talk about
So
exactly is how does this hierarchical framework within information integrated across spatio-temporal scales, like mosaic of nested windows, etc., explain levels of awareness and potentially resolve debates in consciousness science?
So first, the metaphor is a mosaic photograph. And a mosaic photograph is a photograph where every pixel of the photograph is itself a photograph. Your viewers, I invite them to look, just check them out. And you could imagine that each one of those smaller pixels was themselves also constituted of pixels that were photographs in sort of a fractal manner. So this creates a sort of a fractal representational system in which you've got windows nested in windows, nested in windows. And the idea is that the experience that we're having, that you're having, and that I'm having is basically what we call the apex window. So it's sort of the top window in the system. And what it's doing is integrating the lower level windows, which are then in turn integrating lower level windows. So each window is having an experience unto itself and is also integrating the lower level windows. And the idea is that what's known as the binding problem, that what enables a window to have its sort of holistic experience is that window itself is or the elements of it are all vibrating at the same time, which creates a synchronization that allows that window to have its experience. But between different windows at the same level, they're having a different kind of temporal relationship. They're in coherence. So like you and I are having a back and forth. So that's this coherence. And then between up and down is cross-frequency coupling, where you have a very fast one happening at the lower level and then slower ones, but they're in a harmony of some sort. And between these three different kinds of vibrational resonances, this enables the windows to interact and communicate with each other both laterally and vertically. So that's sort of the essence of it. And what this enables is the key issue of panpsychism, which is how is it that the lowest level monads or whatever you want to imagine are sort of the lowest level, how do those integrate into larger and larger windows? And the idea is that through these three processes of synchronization, which is the simultaneity of elements in a single window, coherence, which is the communication between windows at the same level, and cross-frequency coupling, it allows for the binding of information and the nesting of it. And you can see, if you return now to the mosaic photograph metaphor, how that mosaic photograph is in fact integrating all of the lower level windows in this very coherent way, where all the information, some of it is getting abstracted. There's a lot of abstraction that happens as you go up, but it's all there. The final thing I want to suggest is that we can kind of experience these individual windows in phenomenologically. A couple of examples. One, I think, is your tongue. Right now, your tongue, it looked like it was moving, it was doing stuff. Right, you weren't thinking about that. It's got a mind of its own. The tongue is and it's also integrating the taste buds. right? So there's, it's a circuit presumably, but so the idea is that there's like a coherence to the tongue as an entity, and quite possibly other organs, the heart, the gut, may have sort of their own conscious experience. There might be something it's like to be your heart, and you can tune your apex towards it and actually pick up some of the feelings that are happening there, but not the lower level ones. And then also when we experience cognitive dissonance, when something is said in our head, we say something and we go, I don't really believe that. Well, there's a part of your mind which is having that experience, and this is also related to something known as internal family systems, where we may have these sort of different agents essentially in our minds that maybe aren't there all the time. They sort of, some pop up and then others pop up, and so we are really sort of, in this sense, a community, and the dissonance that we experience when we're dealing with a situation is because we have all these different components to ourselves. And when we recognize this, it can be very helpful. So when we say something, it wasn't necessarily sort of coming from our apex, from our highest self. It was coming from some subcomponent of us, which has got its own issues and agendas. And so we have to sort of have to work to let all of our bits get along.
Then tell me, Jonathan, when you first came up with this, or when you first had this epiphany, what were you searching for? What was on your mind building up to this, building up to now? I like that.
Well, I mean, I should say that the now model has been very much a collaborative process. So Justin Riddle is the first author on the paper, and he really was sort of key in sort of helping us to sort out the different types of resonances that can take place. And Tam Hunt also has articulated general resonance theory, which is the general resonance theory is the nested observer window model is more of a meta theory, in the sense that it can actually, you can sort of tweak different assumptions and accommodate a variety of different models. Whereas the general resonance theory has a lot of greater specifications and represents sort of one, in my view, implementation of the nested observer window approach. But I would say that some of the key things that was driving thinking about it in the first place was this issue of the binding problem. How does if consciousness sort of is a fundamental aspect of physical reality, then how is it that that lowest level can integrate into higher and higher levels? But I should say that it's very possible that the nested observer window model is accurate in important respects, and not accurate or in other elements which are conjectures don't pan out. So it's possible that there is there exists nested observer windows. So there are these windows which are sort of organized in the way that I'm suggesting, but that consciousness is not an element of those lower levels, that only the apex has consciousness. It's also possible that it goes down to a certain level, hard to say how far down it goes, but then below that, the windows don't have consciousness. And then it's possible that it goes sort of all the way down. I will say that personally, I feel like there's got to be a bottom and there's got to be a top. It just the idea that would go infinitely down just it doesn't sit well with me. I mean, this is almost an aesthetic, so I can't assert this with great confidence, but I feel like there's a bottom and there's a top. Now, I should say, and this has probably occurred to you and your listeners, is that although we experience ourselves as being the apex, it's quite possible that we are all pixels to yet a higher level of consciousness. Gaia, there are all these different, or some people might refer to God, but whatever that higher level thing is, it shouldn't be too full of itself, because it could also be a pixel to yet a higher level one. So there may be windows upon windows above the level that we are experiencing things. But again, my intuition is that there's also a top, that it doesn't just keep expanding up infinitely. But that's, again, sort of an aesthetic.
Yeah, I guess you pretty much answered my question there, because I was going to go back to the analogy to say, I mean, if you're looking at this mosaic, I mean, surely there's something looking at that mosaic as well, or there's something above that mosaic that just continues to go upward and downward.
Yeah.
Uh, but if we had to take this, let's say, from a scientific perspective, because when it comes to materialist theories of consciousness, and I do think of a panpsychist view, it can be very much a physicalist, materialist view. So if you had to look at what we asked earlier, when someone reports being conscious of an experience, are they truly accessing raw phenomenon or just interpreting, or is it just their interpretation of it? How might the now model help distinguish these two? Or is that possible with the now model?
Well, I mean, I think the now model basically is assuming that every time you bump up to a higher level, that there's a abstraction, a process that's taking place, and that some of the minute details that were being represented at the lower level are not going to be accessed at the higher level. And, we sort of see this too, like, for example, your fingers know where all the keys on the keyboard are, but you would probably, in order to figure out where all the keys are, you'd probably have to like watch where your fingers go and figure it out that way. And, when people are playing the piano, they're playing at an incredible rate, and almost surely they're not thinking about where every keystroke is going to take place. So there definitely is this compression that happens as we go up, and with that compression, the details are lost. And so it's sort of a fundamental element of the model that there's going to be a kind of information loss in the as we bump up and down the system. But in principle, we may be able to sort of start to identify these communities of elements that are in synchronization with each other, and through that process sort of begin to map out what's happening at the different levels, and what is being lost in every level. So although the now model lends itself, I think, to non-material reductionist account, I fully agree that it's helpful and informative, even if you really take a hard-nosed material reductionist perspective, and you can then flesh out all sorts of empirical predictions that fall out of it.
Yeah, look, I think that, well, in this podcast, that's not really the goal. It's not to necessarily put someone on the spot, trying to give them get empirical evidence out of them. The goal is actually to explore this. So I think for anyone who's interested in this model and doesn't know anything about it, when you guys first started with it, what was the thought process like? What were you guys thinking, in terms of, does this have some sort of a teleology, for example? Like, does this go anywhere? Is this purposeful? Where does this go? Does it have free will, for example?
Well, I should say also that I think this was one of the longest papers to write. I think Justin Riddle and I were working on the now model for six years, maybe more. So it was a long process of discussion and unpacking, and key elements only sort of emerged late on. So the apex, which is now sort of the key component of the model, wasn't there up until maybe close to the final year. And once we put a head on the thing, it really sort of helped us to sort of make sense of everything. But I think that there's another model that I'd like to mention that is potentially complementary to the nested observer window model, which does have much more of a sort of metaphysical claims to it, and in that sense is much more speculative than the now model. So maybe let's shift to this other model, which I refer to as which Justin Riddle and I also collaborated on, called the 3 dimensions of time, and then we can actually embed the nested observer window model in the 3 dimensions of time model. So if you'll allow me,
Jonathan, take your time. Go into it as much as you want. If you want the audience to understand this from the core, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. So let's start with what we take as essentially 4 axioms of existence, and these axioms are derived from first-person experience, and the bottom line is that axioms are the things that you just have to assume. You can't prove them. That's a definition of an axiom. And so it makes sense that we have to figure out what it is that we're going to take as our ground, and just recognize that these are assumptions, right? I'm assuming that you are conscious too, that I'm speaking to a conscious person. I can't prove it. I mean, right now I'm just speaking to like an image, but we take it as axioms. Everybody, solipsism is very distasteful, but there's no way to prove that it's not just all you and I'm just a figment. Not even, maybe I'm not only not conscious, I might not even be here. You could be in a dream, but you take it as an axiom that that you're living in an actual physical world with other beings, other conscious beings. So we're all doing this, and you can't prove it, but that's okay, because that's what axioms are. I'm going to put those 2 axioms aside for the moment, and consider the ones that I think really sort of fall out from conscious experience. The first one is what we already talked about before with respect to illusionism, and that is that experience is happening. This is very aligned with Descartes' notion of I think, therefore I am, but I'm not even necessarily, maybe the I part is I'm open to the ego being an illusion, but experience is happening. This it seems to be an essential thing that we are taking for as an axiom. Now, a curious thing about these axioms that sort of also comes from my entertaining without endorsing is even my axioms, I have a little bit of uncertainty about. As I mentioned before, there's a tiny hint which I'm open to illusionism. But even as I list out my axioms, they're sort of in the order of confidence. So I'm most confident that experience happens. The second thing is that experience is always happening in the present, that there is this sort of window with a thickness to it, right? So there's the now actually has a little bit of thickness. We're always, and that is where consciousness is always happening. It's always in the present. So the present is fundamentally different from the past. You can imagine the future, you can remember the past, but you're always doing that in the present. So now is very special because that's where it's all happening. That's where consciousness takes place. The third is that the very nature of experience itself is a flow. There is a now. It's always continually in this dynamic process of unfolding. So we are always, in a sense, moving through time, or time, we'll come back to this, time is moving through us. So there's always this flow of consciousness from now to now to now. And then the final one, and this is the one that I think is, sort of the most tentative of the experiential axioms, but it sure does have a strong sense in our day-to-day experiences, which is that we have some capacity of control, right? I can decide to do this podcast or not. I can look over here, I can look over there. That consciousness actually fundamentally is experienced with agency, that agency is sort of a key aspect of our conscious state. Now, the interesting thing is that these four axioms, the arising of experience, or that experience exists, that it's always happening in the now, that experience is intrinsically a flow of time, and that we have some kind of free will, some control over it. All these things are dismissed presently in a mainstream, dismissed or just elusive to mainstream science. So the occurrence of experience, that's the hard problem of consciousness, and the difficulty of it is why illusionism is so popular. The privileged present, the fact that it's all happening in the now, in the block model universe of physics, which basically assumes that the past, the present, future all exist simultaneously, there's nothing special about now. And also, you can't move through it. There's no flow of time because the past, the present, and the future all exist simultaneously. And then, of course, free will is the notion that consciousness has a causal role is problematic for all sorts of reasons, including that there's a sort of a cause, an uncaused cause, as it were. So for me, there's this really interesting challenge where the things that seem to be the most axiomatic aspects of my existence don't have a place currently in the sort of standard model in science. So that has encouraged me to try to think about, well, what might a model look like that could incorporate these things? And so the model that I'm about to describe, I want to emphasize it's a toy model. It's massively underdeveloped, but that also means that it's an invitation for people to run with it and to try to create their own version of it. And you might take some of the assumptions and not others. But it's sort of an example of the kind of model that I think might be able to accommodate these four axioms. The other thing I should emphasize is that that I think in principle it might be formalized mathematically, but that it is wholly not as currently defined. And even the terms such as dimensions are used in an informal manner, although I do think it's possible that they could be formalized. Now, the final sort of thing in the setup before I actually get into the model is I think also that it's very helpful if you can, we have a disproportionate amount of our brain is dedicated to visual cortex. And when we can visualize something, it really helps in terms of thinking about the idea. So coming up with models of consciousness that actually you can generate a visual model for and play with and manipulate and think about, I think is very powerful. That's why the nested observer window model, I think with its mosaic photograph that provides this, makes it much more concrete. And the 3 dimensions of time model sort of builds on this notion of let's create a 3-dimension, a visualizable representation. And it is therefore convenient that the model is 3 dimensions, so we can map what I'm going to refer to as the 3 dimensions of time onto the 3 dimensions of space. Now, in so doing, there's a bit of arbitrariness about how I map which dimension of time to which dimension of space, and I would invite people to switch it around, but we're going to go with one mapping, okay? So here we go. Let's start with the first dimension. So the first dimension is objective time. This is clock time. This is the thing that's the most clearly measurable. And for the purposes of discussion here, we're going to have that be forward. Okay, so basically you've got a window and it's moving forward in objective time. In a every moment it's moving another second, right? So that's the simplest one. Now, the second dimension is subjective time, okay? And we're going to imagine that being up. And so the idea is as the window moves through information space, which is essentially time, it's got a vector in objective time and subjective time. Now, if that vector is exclusively in objective time, it has no movement whatsoever in subjective time, it's as if you're under anesthesia. There's absolutely no experience whatsoever. And if the vector is exclusively up, which doesn't typically happen, but in principle could, that would be where it's just subjective time and objective time stands still. So this could be like when people are on psychedelics and it seems like the clock has stopped moving. This may be the experience during mystical experiences, awakening experiences, where it seems as if time is an illusion. What I think they mean by that is objective time is stopped or is illusion. Even when you're having an awakening experience and time is allegedly an illusion, you're still having moment after moment after moment of subjective experience. So there's always, anytime you are having an experience, you're moving in subjective time. Now, the angle can also vary, and we all experience this. Sometimes we move faster in subjective time relative to objective time, and other times we move slower. So if you're in a car accident and it seems like time is moving very slowly, you've got a greater vector in greater vector in subjective time than in objective time. You can also think of this as like the number of sort of the frame rate. So if you're going like this, you're having a lot of subjective frames per objective moment. So it's almost like you've got a very fast photography, right? That's doing a very high frame rate. And then when you're going maybe in a very deep conversation, we've got a lot of information per moment, perhaps as you're listening to this thing, then time may seem like it's going very quickly because every moment has got a greater vector in objective time than subjective time. So you're having these bigger sort of blocks of experience. So those are the two dimensions, objective time and subjective time. And I think that the idea that subjective time is as real as objective time may be sort of a challenge, but if you think about it, if anything, subjective time is more important, more real than objective time. Like, would you rather live a day that felt like a lifetime or a lifetime that felt like a day? I think most of us would prefer the day that felt like a lifetime. Okay, so you're maybe wondering well, you probably know, but your readers may be wondering what the third dimension of time is. And the third dimension of time is alternative time. It's the idea that at every moment, our window has a little bit of wiggle room and can essentially choose or is able to navigate alternative possible timelines. So what this means is that the future is open. And with that addition, that provides the opportunity for free will, because consciousness is actually able in some manner to choose between alternative next moments. And there's not a lot of wiggle room in any particular moment. So it's not like we're entirely free. There's all these pressures that are pushing us one way or another. Another metaphor I like, by the way, is thinking about as this like a sailor sailing, where we're being there's the wind and the waves and the current, and there's no power. We're reliant on the wind to move, but nevertheless, we still can navigate the rudder and the sails to some degree. And so that metaphor is sort of the idea that we're essentially sailing our window through the three dimensions of time. Now, notice this approach now is able to accommodate the four things that I just mentioned. So subjective experience involves windows that have an axis or a vector in this heretofore not acknowledged subjective dimension of reality. And it's very plausible that many things, that this is sort of the way that panpsychism works, is that all the lower level things have a vector in a subjective experience. So it provides a place for subjectivity. The movement of the window through objective and subjective time produces a flow of time, and also allows you to move through the block universe, because it's sort of a block multiverse, and you're moving through objective time relative to subjective time. So it now gives you a way to think about how to actually have subjective experience. Also, you have the present now is where is the window's location in objective time relative to subjective time. And finally, free will is the capacity to choose between alternative dimensions. Now, the final thing in this model. So far, I've had the window moving through time. But another way to think about it is that time is moving through all the windows. So we imagine all the windows as essentially fixed, and time is moving through us. And what that allows is for each one of us to be able to have, if we were all moving through time, then we'd all be branching off in different parallel universes. Whereas when time is moving through us and we've got this vector and alternative time as it approaches us, each one of us has got our own little vector, which is allowing us to carve off the possible next moment, but they all get integrated together in the present. And so the collapse of alternative time in the present allows for us all to be sort of staying together. And so we can kind of imagine this as we're like a giant kite of consciousness where time is passing through us and we're all tethered together and not veering off into different things. And then this allows all of our nested observer windows, they're ahead of us, and each one of them is also moving in these 3 dimensions of time, and they're sort of pulling things together as they get to us, and then we're moving as well. And this whole kite of consciousness moving through time potentially provides a way to think about how subjectivity could have a foundation in physical reality.
It's a lot, eh? That's I'm wondering if the average listener is going to go back and because this is that type of podcast. Someone's going to go back and rewatch this at least about 5 to 6 times to finally wrap their head around it. I know I will. So, okay, let me get this straight. So, Jonathan, if you think of when you did this, was this coming from a psychologist entering the realm of physics and understanding that there's certain aspects here that just have flaws that are not being addressed? Or were you always someone interested in the physical reality and noticed that these vectors, etc., existed and then tried to implement the psychological element afterwards? How did you come to do this?
So I was I'm a huge fan of Brian Greene, although I'm sure he would take great issue with many of the things that I say, and might even be aghast to hear that he was an inspiration for some of these ideas.
You inspired something that he might really not be happy with.
Exactly. I'm pretty confident he will not be happy about this, for
Yeah.
16 different reasons. But that said, when I was hearing, the Nova Special and the Elegant Universe, which is just such a wonderful set, and learning that with string theory, that the way that they got out of these really thorny issues was to assume additional dimensions to physical reality. And it was like, well, consciousness, if anything, deserves an additional dimension. It's consciousness, and so that got me thinking about sort of the 2 dimensions. And then as I sort of dove into it more and found out that the standard model doesn't allow or assumes essentially that that the flow of time and the privilege present are an illusion of consciousness, that sort of emboldened me to think, well, maybe this really is something that physicists should consider. And I actually had the privilege of hearing Brian Greene give a talk here in Santa Barbara, and I was able to ask him a question. And I asked him, how do you reconcile the experiential dynamic quality of experience where there's a clear flow of time with physics sort of static view that it's just an illusion? And he said, I see a psychiatrist. Consciousness is capable of all sorts of illusions, and the flow of time is just another one of those. And for me, I think that's defensible. I mean, I encourage him to take that approach if that's what works for him. But it doesn't work for me to just dismiss the flow of time as an illusion. Doesn't feel adequate, and it suggests that if that's what your physics model requires, that you really should consider other approaches that might be able to accommodate this seemingly fundamental aspect of existence.
I think, okay, and let's get back to that. Do you refer to that as the nowing when it's moving through you at that point?
Through the window, that's the nowing, exactly, yes.
If someone else was watching this, listening to it, perhaps an undergrad, a postgrad, someone wanting to take this further, which aspects of this work do you think need the most refinement?
I mean, all of it. So I should emphasize on my website, you can find both the nested observer window model and the 3 dimensions of time model. And so I would say—
I'll put links to all of that for you, Jonathan, as well.
Great. I would say that sort of one key thing is objective time, has this a really clear metric, right? It's the clock time. Whereas the measure of subjective time, like how do you what's the units of subjective time, is a really sort of intriguing thing. I mean, we intuitively know that we experience the passage of time in going faster and going slower, but can we really sort of nail down what that unit is? And then also reconciling. Are you still there? It looks like you're very still, but you could be frozen. Well, I can't hear you.
Oh, sorry. I said I can see you, but for some reason it did say the connection was super low.
Yeah. Okay. So you were frozen there for
anyone watching or listening. There's a massive storm outside. I'm sorry about that. But yeah, Jonathan, you're still live on my side. Everything looks good.
Okay, great. All right. So essentially, a second issue is the how to measure the movement in subjective time in a very precise way. And I think that's doable. There are all sorts of different sort of time perception types of techniques. But one of the things that is challenging is the idea that the different nested observer windows may be actually having different vectors in objective versus subjective time. So the visual system may well have a steeper vector. So it's having more subjective moments per objective moment than the apex. And this may help to reconcile a key sort of thorn in the side of this theory, which is a finding by David Eagleman. That's a really ingenious study. He essentially had people engage in something the equivalent of bungee cord jumping while they were looking at a device that had a flicker to it, and they had to sort of decipher what the information in the flicker was. And what he found is that even though their experience of time was very much expanded when they were doing this bungee jumping activity, their capacity for deciphering the flickering device was not enhanced. And so what he concluded is that that it was just an illusion that time is slowing down, but you're not actually seeing a increase in the temporal resolution of the brain. And what I would argue is that when you have this, when you're doing the bungee cord jumping, the movement in time, subjective time of the apex is changed, giving it a more subjective moments per objective moment, but the lower level windows are staying the same. Their angle hasn't changed, and that's why the system is equally good at recognizing the what's happening in that flickering device, even though time is slowing down. And there are some other studies which have found a relationship between temporal acuity and subjective experience. But the key idea then is that what we need to do is find a measure that captures the time frequency of the apex. And the idea is that the apex may actually be vibrating, resonating at a much slower rate than we typically think. It may be sort of at the the level of a second or more, which is why, we can process visually things happening very quickly, but sort of in terms of the rate of ideas, if they come too fast, we can't, there's a limit to how much we can hold on to. People may want to slow down the video here because I've been talking so fast. So so understanding the sort of the time rate of the different windows, I think, is a really important thing. And then the third thing, the most speculative thing, is this notion of alternative time. And here, I think it's possible that the mathematics that's been used in the many worlds theory in quantum physics might be applicable. But rather than imagining that that we're constantly branching off in sort of the many worlds view, when in Schrodinger's cat, there's one version of you that finds a living cat and another version of you that finds a dead cat, and we're constantly branching off into these alternative worlds constantly. And in many ways, it's the least parsimonious model ever articulated because of the number of simultaneous branching universes that are required to do it. But in this model, all those are just possibilities, and only the reality that actually is observed by every window is actually comes to pass. So the kite of consciousness is defining a singular reality as opposed to all this branching ones. Nevertheless, I think it's possible that that model could be adapted to capture the mathematics of what I'm imagining. And then again, though, with respect to this alternative time dimension, what are the units? What formalizing what that would constitute and turning that into a dimension, a meaningful dimension, I think could be extraordinarily challenging, but I think possible.
Yeah, I think it's really fascinating. There's so many implications to this and so many ways to approach it regarding this podcast specifically. I have some specific questions about the now model, if you'd like me to ask. Would you mind? Yeah, okay.
Sure, no, please.
One of the first ones I had was, let's say, in terms of the core framework, you describe consciousness as this nested mosaic, as we've just discussed, where each observer window is like a tile made of smaller tiles, let's say. But how does that puzzle, if you were to explain it to someone, explain it to me like I'm 5. Okay. If you were to see it, feeling like, if you were to explain this puzzle being one puzzle or unified as a single self, even though the brain's processing is so distributed in this regard, how would you explain that? How would it all become one? Does this ever become one? Is the experience ever unified in any sense?
Yeah,
does that question make sense? I'm not sure if
it does, and that's where the apex becomes so important, because if you imagine that you're looking at that very top photograph, that photograph is integrating all those lower level pixels, and each one of those pixels is integrating all those lower level pixels. Now, each one of those individual pixels may be having their own experience, but you are just having the experience of the top window, but you're still able to turn your apex and focus on different lower level windows. And so you're actually able to integrate a significant proportion of those lower level ones, and they're all getting integrated from the lower level ones and the lower level ones. So when you imagine being the top window in this sort of hierarchy of windows upon windows, and all the windows have some transparency to them, so even the lowest level one is getting some of its image into that top one. So what I would want to do is to show, to sort of create a visual representation of this, windows upon windows upon windows, show it to the 5-year-old. They'd look through that top window and go, oh yeah, I see, that really is integrated. But then they'd walk along the side and they go, oh, but look at all those lower level windows that are all doing their different thing. And then they'd peek in a lower level window and go, oh, look at that, this one's having an experience too. And by actually interacting, and we're actually, a goal is to create a physical visual representation of it, where you can actually sort of inspect it in a science museum. Actually encountering it, I think, would help them to understand how it's simultaneously unified from the vantage of the apex, but also has all these disparate elements.
Yeah, it's kind of, it opens up possibilities in the sense that consciousness at the apex occurs, and then the other emergent thresholds, or even panpsychic across all scales, you could think about it. And then, but I would, if you think about it from an idealist perspective, do you feel like each of these nested windows could have information stored for an ultimate Mosaic final entity?
Yeah, yeah. So in principle, there could be sort of all elements in just the imagination of the apex. So it also lends itself to idealism in a certain sense. Although, you know, I will say that I would, this may sound sacrilegious, but the sort of the view that comes up in sort of Judeo-Christian models of God being sort of this all-knowing, omnipotent, knowing past, present, future, and everything, that seems just horrific. There'd be no wonder, like it would be incredibly tedious, and so if there is a final apex, I'm hoping that it's one on a mission of discovery and of unfolding, and that each one of us is actually contributing to its journey in a meaningful way, rather than this sort of awful, omnipotent, omnipresent version that is represented. So when you take the perspective of God in that model, I don't know it.
Yeah, no, I think I agree with you with that. And I think moving on to that sort of creativity and sort of looking out for new experiences and wonder, let's tie it back to your classic work. How might mind wandering let mid-level windows chat laterally, let's say? So skipping the apex to spark creativity, perhaps. Any predictions from now in terms of
yeah. So we oftentimes have the experience of mind wandering while driving, right? And so we're driving, and yet our mind is really somewhere else. And yet, if you sort of look at what's happening, there's a part of us that seems like it's really reasonably paying attention, right? So in this sense, you can kind of see the different modules. You've got the mind wandering module, which is where the apex is focused, and then you've got the driving model, which is still able to, it's very visibly conscious in all sorts of ways. Now, an interesting question is, what happens when we shift our consciousness back to the driving, and now the apex is no longer focusing on the mind wandering? Has the mind wandering entirely stopped at that point? That's sort of the typical assumption, but maybe not. Maybe when we focus back on the road, the mind wandering is just happening, but behind the scenes, right? And so this provides a way to think about incubation. You know, how is it that Poincaré was just stepping on the bus, and then boom, the solution to Fuchsian functions and its relationship to geometry of the past came to mind for him. Well, if he was mind wandering sort of unconsciously, but the mind wandering system may actually have been having an experience, then this really makes a lot of sense. So the possibility that we could have multiple streams of consciousness going on in our mind simultaneously, and that sometimes we're attending to the mind wandering and sometimes we're not, but it's still percolating without us, provides a way to think about how creativity and creative incubation might take place.
Yeah, and so I think that then that sort of crosstalk and cross experience, would that then explain, or how would that explain something like a split brain case? Is it the same thing?
Yeah, so the split brain is sort of if the closest thing to evidence for, or one of the strongest bits of evidence for the model is the split brain case, where it really does seem as if you're able to measure the separate streams of consciousness associated with the left and the right hemisphere. And it's interesting that there have been some cases where people with split brains actually can do things that that people with intact brains can't do, in the sense that you can give different tasks to the two hemispheres and they can engage in them simultaneously. And one idea that Justin Riddle and I are excited to explore is the possibility that other types of dissociations that show up from time to time that appear to be indicative of these separate windows could show similar advantageous capacity. So, for example, if you have someone with dissociative identity disorder, can you have one identity listen to one ear and the other identity listen to the other ear in a dichotic listening task? We have different messages going into both ears, and can they actually extract more information than somebody who is experiencing it in a unified way? Or there's also a phenomenon known as tulpas, where people basically imagine that they have an imaginary friend and talk to their imaginary friend and just assume this imaginary friend exists. And allegedly, these individuals experience, or their report is they experience one day where the tulpa wakes up and takes on sort of a mind of its own. And so then is it possible to give, again, in a dichotic listening experiment, we have one message going to one ear and another message going to the other, can you have the tulpa pay attention to one message and the tulpa man, so the person with the tulpa paying attention to another, and can they show a greater capacity to listen to both things simultaneously? So these types of experiments could be sort of a first pass at being able to illustrate the independence streams of these different things, and more final internal family systems, where you've got sort of these different, essentially, family members taking place in the mind simultaneously, and can we sort of see that those different systems, that people have been sort of practiced with that, can they also have the different elements attend to different components?
Yeah, I think it's there's so many broader implications, and you already mentioned those two now. But another one was what you mentioned earlier when it comes to dissonance. It's sort of that poor inter-window coherence occurring, which is quite fascinating. And then, I mean, if you had to think about it, look further, do you think that how do you, let's say now holds up? How could it change how we think about psychiatry, AI, design, or even collective or psychedelic consciousness? What's the most exciting extension you're pondering right now?
Well, I mean, one thing that I find is very helpful is when I find myself as dealing with a difficult situation and stuff comes up for me, and if I appreciate that that's just one window speaking, that's just the opinion of that particular window, and I don't need to view it as sort of my own. And in so doing, it allows us to take sort of a different perspective. It does sort of relate to sort of the mindfulness perspective, where rather than being the speaker of our mind, we're the listener, right? And so the apex is basically just watching all these different windows providing stuff. And when you take the advantage of, oh, geez, that window it's a little bit like Inside Out, right? The Pixar movie Inside Out. I think it's Pixar. It's very much like that, in which you come to appreciate that these different voices in your mind are holding different perspectives, and that you're just listening to and sort of trying to, as the apex, to reach some sort of integration of all those different voices. I think it's also really exciting possibility to start to really dive into the neuroscience of this and try to identify these lower level windows, and through patterns of synchronization and cross-frequency coupling and using advances in different types of brain measurements to extract this. And then also going back to the three dimensions of time model, if we recognize that we are all in this sort of kite of consciousness that is moving through information space, and each one of us has our own little sail, essentially, in this kite, then we can come to realize that each one of us is actually part of this larger whole, and our actions are impacting how reality is manifesting. And if we can adjust our sails in synchrony, if we can get sort of a movement of people all turning their sail in a particular way, that could really help humanity in powerful ways. It could also hurt humanity in powerful ways if we turn collectively in dangerous directions. So the model sort of lends itself to thinking about the community and the relationship that we have with it, and our own individual contribution to helping the kite of consciousness move in a productive direction.
Yeah, I think the overall message is also beautiful. If you look at the always on type of world that we're in, it's almost like a push for a constant present moment focus is something that we need right now.
Yeah.
That's
right. We're always in the present.
It's called the now model as well, just because of that alone. So props to you for even coming up with something like that. But when you think about psychiatry as a whole, and you look at things like mindfulness and trying to be in that present moment, do you think this model in the future, as someone who studies psychology, who knows this field so well, will impact us in a positive way?
Well, I hope so. And there's another thing that I'm doing here, which indirectly contributes to something that I think is really important for society to cultivate. And that is, I'm letting my hair down, or we're letting our hair down. We're making conjectures that are far out. We're exploring in areas of physics that people might say we have no business being there, and even neuroscience going beyond certainly my understanding of neuroscience. And this approach of sort of boldly yet humbly exploring alternatives is a trait that I think is of incredible importance for humanity, known as openness to experience. Now, openness to experience is part of what's considered the big five personality traits. So you can remember this with the acronym OCEAN, which stands for openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism or negative valence. And these are the sort of five ways in which people tend to vary. And openness is incredibly valuable in all sorts of ways. So let me just list off all the things that openness to experience is basically, it's almost identical with curiosity. It's this interest in gaining new experiences and understanding new things and appreciating art and appreciating nature. It's associated with intelligence, creativity, intellectual humility, conceptual expansiveness, curiosity, as I mentioned, appreciation of art, appreciation of nature, concern for the future of humanity, concern for the future of nature. It's also associated, for those people who don't care about any of those things, if there are any, it's also associated with connection with other people, because if you're open and you're curious, then you're able to listen to what other people have to say. And you're also interesting because you've heard what people have to say. And it's associated, even if none of that lands with you, with longevity and quality of life as people get older, because their minds remain fresh and active. Oh, it's also associated with increased tolerance for alternative perspectives and reduced prejudice and racism. So the world really needs more openness to experience. And my view is that playing with ideas such as this model is a way to sort of foster openness to experience and imagining different ways of doing the model. Like, don't even get stuck in this one. You try a different version out. I advocate that. And we have with Madeline Gross, my longtime collaborator, we've been developing techniques for cultivating openness to experience. And it turns out that openness to experience is very much like mindfulness. It's not just a trait, it's a state of experiencing openness. And the more often you experience that state, the more open you become as a trait. So our view is that openness could become the next mindfulness, where people are cultivating openness, and that will then lead to all the or many of those potentially positive benefits that I see as being associated with it. So I think that there is a real possible connection between this model or entertaining this model and cultivating this quality of openness that I think is so important both for individuals and for humanity more generally.
And Jonathan, do you think there's a way to explain openness using the model?
Yeah. So one way to think about it is the flexibility of the apex, the ability to sort of turn to different aspects of experience. One thing that's interesting is that people who are open actually they think about more different things. So they also think about more negative things, right? Because they're able to confront those things. So being able to shift, having the flexibility to focus in on different elements may be sort of a key aspect to having sort of a well lubricated apex, may be sort of a key aspect to openness. It's also possible that that you can step back to a sort of a meta level, that there may be that the apex can either step back or can focus on itself as a lower level window. There may be one of the ways that we think about meta awareness is that you have a representation of your experience as one of the windows, and then when you turn the apex to that lower level thing, you get this sort of mirror. So focusing on the meta awareness may be another way to that meta awareness window, may be another way to cultivate openness. And then I think there are probably a host of, this is a small bird that has been hiding up until now, but has now joined me. He'll probably come in and out. So yeah, those are some of the ways in which openness could get integrated. And I should also mention that I suggested that openness may be a sort of the next mindfulness, but I also think it may be very valuable to combine openness with mindfulness. And along with my partner, Amanda Greger, we've talked about open mindfulness as a where you sort of get the best of both worlds. So you want to be open, but not so open that your brain falls out, right? You need to have some discernment and, be open, but maybe not open to skydiving without a parachute or riding a motorcycle without a helmet. And so the mindfulness may provide a grounding and a discernment where the openness provides sort of this the adventurous part. And so combining the two may be very helpful. And indeed, we've developing an app with Madeline Gross, and she found that when we combine mindfulness with curiosity, that seems to produce some of the greatest advantages. So I think that gaining this sort of growth mindset, that we're not stuck in that we don't have to be stuck in a particular personality forever, but can develop, and this is well appreciated with mindfulness, but other qualities as well, such as openness, and combining the two is a really important direction for humanity to pursue.
Yeah, I think my Twitter bio back in the day used to be passionately curious, reasonably skeptical. So I think
That's spot on.
yeah, that's pretty much where I'm headed with that. But when you look at your work, Jonathan, over the years, you've done so much, and for me, it is also intriguing to see this shift because it seems to be a later shift in your life, the way you guys are exploring this and doing this in a very, very different, unique way. After decades of exploring mind wandering, mindfulness, creativity, awareness, we didn't even touch on creativity as much yet. I had so many questions. I just went off track.
Well,
But
bring me back.
yeah, so but after decades of exploring all of this, what aspect of the mind's nature do you feel most uncertain about?
I think that the thing that sort of most intrigues me, and as one gets older, I think this naturally happens, is uh, is the question about the the relationship between consciousness and physical reality and the brain. When we die, does it just shut off? Is it just over? It's like we weren't here, or in these near-death experiences and all the sort of reports, is it possible that we just shift exclusively into the subjective dimension of time, and it continues? And I do genuinely feel that there's a real possibility that consciousness may have the capacity to persist beyond death. I think it's possible that consciousness may have certain uh, anomalous capabilities that that have so far eluded a rigorous documentation. And interestingly, the three dimensions of time model also provides a way of thinking about how it could be that consciousness is capable of these remarkable, all the examples of parapsychological kinds of things, and yet it can't seem to be shown in a rigorous way at the level of sort of scientific documentation. And basically, the idea here is that every individual window has its own degree of wiggle room. But when you try to do a scientific study, you're basically locking all the windows together into a single window, and that gives it less wiggle room. And the more pre-registration you do, and the more observers that are part of the study, the less wiggle room you have. So it's like you've got the nimbleness of a tugboat as an individual, but you've got an ocean liner which just can't shift with that kind of nimbleness to show those things. So I think it's possible that there may be, each one of us may experience anomalous things that are difficult to reconcile with a fully material reductionist worldview, and yet at the same time, none of that will ever translate into the larger documented thing, which makes nobody happy, right? The parapsychologists go, no, we've shown this long ago, and the mainstream goes, wait a minute, you're saying this exists, but you can't show it? And I would counter, consciousness exists, but I can't show that either. So it's not that unreasonable.
Yeah, I think it's one of these deepest questions in reality, and it's so fun to explore this topic. And I think that where you're at in your life, you can see that there's a level of excitement that comes with this, where you can tell you're exploring a field that's really beyond your usual work, but it's still fundamentally part of your work, and it's probably the most intriguing question of them all. So who could blame you?
Yeah. But it is frustrating because, the more out there you get, and especially in this sort of model, the harder it is to bring the rigor that I apply to my other research. But I want to emphasize, all of this sort of speculation, it's really critical to carry on the rigorous hard nose. So we're still doing mind-wandering research. We're still doing all sorts of very rigorous, tightly controlled studies. And I think that a lot of times what happens to researchers is when they sort of go off on these metaphysics things, they abandon their mainstream, the sort of the meat and potatoes, and then they get dismissed. It's like, oh, that's too bad, they fell off the wagon. But the goal is, by sort of maintaining these multiple streams, that people can write off some of my speculations, but they hopefully won't write me off.
Yeah. Yeah, no, exactly. I think that is definitely a theme. And in order to prevent that from happening, let's move back onto the mind wandering aspect. Your studies,
Sure.
your scientific studies frame mind wandering not as mere distraction, but as a core cognitive mode. So, what does this tell us about the temporal organization of consciousness and how it evolves over moments, hours, or lifetimes?
Maybe clarify that when you say the temporal organization, what do you mean?
So, when you talk about mind wandering, as not as merely as a distraction, but as a core cognitive mode, what I'm trying to ask is, what does that tell us about the organization of consciousness from a time perspective, and how it evolves over moments, hours, or lifetimes? Does that make a little bit more sense?
I think so. Well, I mean, one of the interesting things is the substantial proportion of time that we spend mind wandering. Estimates suggest that it's there's an estimate of 50%, which I think is extreme. But in our studies, we find 20% of the time people are not really in the present. They're thinking about other stuff. And what this illustrates is, and a lot of times they're thinking about current concerns. This is sort of one of the Klinger sort of identified this back when there was just a handful of people studying mind wandering. And so what this suggests then is that a significant amount of mental activity is based not in the present, but in addressing the past, imagining the future, dealing with all the different things that we are encountering. And then it's interesting to think about sort of from an evolutionary perspective. Did we invent mind wandering, or are other animals engaging in it as well? And I think that that there are some really close parallels to mind wandering when in other animals as well. So a prey animal, when they're say at the lake drinking, they're drinking, but then they look up and are paying attention to the other thing. So there's part of their attention is being dedicated to the task at hand, drinking, but then they're also paying attention to worrying about predators. And so you can imagine that also when elephants are running into difficulties, not finding enough food and stuff, the lead elephant, female elephant, has to come up with a plan for where to go next. And you could well imagine that elephant is engaging in mind wandering as she's struggling to find that food that she's looking for, and coming up with and then a visualization, because they can go really far directions. So my guess is that mind wandering is that we engage in it in a much more extensive way than other species, but that the sort of the prototypes of it exist way down the phylogenetic scale.
Yeah, I find it quite interesting how, as a doctor, when I interact with patients, and if you notice someone mind wandering, especially when I used to work in psychiatry, how people confabulate so much when you question them about it.
Yeah, well, confabulation is really really interesting, and it sort of hits on the fact that that all of us are constructing our realities and creating a narrative, and even creating our vision. You're just in a dark skull, and yet you're experiencing all of this. So it's all of experience is a construction.
So, Jonathan, when it comes to creativity, so does creativity highlight the shortcomings of conscious deliberation, or the unique powers of unconscious processes? And perhaps, do you have any examples of how you could align now to this?
Yeah, so we have found in some situations that when you're trying too hard to come up with something, that can actually be problematic. And we've all experienced this in the case of like the tip of the tongue, right? You've experienced some word that just doesn't come to mind. As long as you're actively trying to find it, you can't get it. And so the best thing to do is just to let it rest, and then it comes to you. And oftentimes with creativity too, we'll just run up against a brick wall and just reach an impasse. And in those situations, the best thing to do is just to sleep on it, as we say, and allow that unconscious processes to incubate, allow the mind wandering to sort of naturally progress in its different directions, potentially, progressing without even our experience of it. So again, remember when I was mentioning before about this sort of the value of an apex that's able to sort of move back and forth. I think it's important for creativity to be have periods of really intense focus where you're defining the problem in a very meaningful way and really thinking through all of the key elements of it. And then to take a period where you're just allowing stuff to come up and sort of downplaying frontal cortex and allowing default mode network to do its thing. And then when you have an aha experience, then you need to go back and really scrutinize it carefully with that rigorous, explicit thing. So it's really a dance between conscious and unconscious processes, between mind wandering and rigorous scrutiny.
Do you think it's possible that creativity emerges despite consciousness rather than because of it?
I think that, if Roy Baumeister and Kathleen Voss sort of looked at issues about how creative people were when they were, really sort of focused versus not. And they found that consciousness seemed to be very important. So I would say that you really need consciousness for to maximize creativity, and that the whole system is sort of built to alert consciousness to when creative ideas happen. So you're mind wandering, and then if you have a good idea, what happens? You have that aha experience, which is like, hey, consciousness, pay attention. This is important. Let's test this out. But then I definitely think that the process of evaluating a creative idea, which is a key component of creativity, critically depends on that rigorous frontal lobe scrutiny, where you figure out, this won't work for that reason. And this is why with psychedelics and cannabis and stuff, people may have good ideas, but their capacity for evaluating them carefully may be disrupted. So they feel like they've had this brilliant idea, but part of that is because they've undermined the evaluation component of the creative process. So it's really a dance.
Yeah, well, that explains most of my best friend and our ideas not coming to fruition in adulthood. Many of those plans never came through. We thought we had breakthroughs many times.
But one of the things that we have been realizing is that there may be a value to those false ahas that we don't appreciate, which is that even though they're not right, they're very reinforcing. A false aha feels virtually as good as a real aha. And so it encourages us to stay in that space, to stay in the creative space. So it encourages what I call mind wondering, playful, curious exploration. So even the false ahas have their value.
Well, we've touched on the creativity part. I mean, just to highlight the fact that your body of work is so diverse, we haven't even touched on your artwork yet. There's so much to discuss. Your art research specifically shows it can reshape perception and cognition in profound ways. What unique mental mechanisms does art activate that everyday experiences don't?
So the idea is, and we did touch on this, is this notion of openness. So a key aspect of openness to experience is the appreciation of art. And so in the same way that people who are high in openness to experience appreciate art, the idea is that appreciating art can induce a temporary state of openness to experience. And what we find is that when we expose people to brief, this is work pioneered by Madeline Gross, when we expose people to brief animated film shorts that are both beautiful but also sort of uh, uh, unconventional, that this can lead to various different metrics that could be characterized as increases in state openness, including they're more creative in writing a short story. They're more curious in the information that they seek out. They're more conceptually expansive. So if you ask people in normal situations, is a car a vehicle? Everyone agrees yes. But if you ask them, is a foot a vehicle? A lot of disagreement. Or is a camel a vehicle? A lot of disagreement. And they're more likely to think of larger things as part of a broader category. So the idea is that art creates this expansiveness that allows them to notice things that they wouldn't have noticed otherwise. And we refer to this as expansive salience, this idea that things that would otherwise have gone unnoticed become visible and valuable, and that's reinforcing to notice these things that otherwise might get missed.
I'm not sure if we brought this up, Jonathan, but within this model, within the now model, how do animals or AI fall into this? What role do they play, and how do we incorporate them into this?
So one way to think about with animals is that we have layers upon layers upon layers, and that as we become more cognitively complex, we develop higher and higher layers that are able to integrate more information. So we, likely have just more layers than does a mouse. So that's sort of one way to think about it. And then also in terms of the lower level windows, they have a faster vibrational rate. Their flicker rate is faster, and that may be why it's so hard to swat a fly, because they're actually their subjective experience is actually unfolding at a different rate than ours is. So let's see, you were asking about the animals, and there was another part to that question as well, wasn't there?
Yeah, and artificial intelligence.
Oh, artificial intelligence, yeah. So if the now model is right, and we have these sort of layers upon layers upon layers, that's really sort of not the way that artificial intelligence is operating currently. And so one sort of metaphor is a Russian doll. The Russian dolls from the outside, one that's loaded with all those lower layers, is looks identical to one that is just got the outside. But of course, they're very different from the inside. And it may be that AI is basically like a Russian doll with none of those lower level nested observer windows that are building up, that are creating consciousness. So it may be very intelligent, but it likely has no consciousness at all. Now, plausibly, you could generate an AI that emulated the kind of nested resonances that our brains may have, and this could plausibly be implemented with electromagnetic fields at various different levels. So I think it's possible that that AI could in the future be developed that could have this property. But if the nested observer window model is true, right now it's very far from doing that. Now, a whole other question is, would you want to have a conscious AI? And I would be very wary of that, because once AI is conscious, then it needs to have rights, and it's its own concerns and agenda, and that's something that I think it's going to be very difficult to manage.
Yeah, I mean, we can barely manage each other, so.
Right, exactly.
Okay. Your work is so interdisciplinary that it blurs psychology, philosophy, neuroscience, etc. Where does psychology most need philosophical tools when tackling something like consciousness or the mind-body problem, in your opinion?
Yeah, in physics, there's this expression, something just shut up and calculate, and don't worry about the ontological implications. And I think psychologists have sort of done the same thing. They've bought into, and especially neuroscientists as well, they've bought into a particular worldview about the nature of the brain and the nature of consciousness and the nature of human beings as basically just being complex machines. In principle, no different from a complex machine, and notions of spirit and soul and consciousness having more than that is just assumed to be a superstition of the past. And I think that that philosophy provides a backdrop for to investigate different possible viable ontologies, and to recognize that to just shut up and assume this one particular perspective about the nature of the brain is really not scientific, because you're basically excluding all sorts of possibilities a priori. So that's, I think, one important place where philosophy is valuable. And then a second place is just, what are the interesting questions? What questions can we take the scientific method that philosophy has addressed for a long time and make progress? So, what is the value of believing in free will? Not just does free will exist, but what are the impact of having that belief on our behaviors? So there are all sorts of, I think, really interesting philosophical questions that can inform what psychologists study.
And on the flip side, where do philosophical debates on consciousness stray too far away from the empirical data, and how can we ground them better?
Well, I think that philosophers have increasingly begun to pay attention to the scientific findings, and I think that you certainly want to use the scientific findings to constrain your conceptualizations of things, and they provide really sort of important and valuable lines of inquiry. And then also, for example, if you look at sort of phenomenology, I'm a big advocate of the value of considering phenomenology, but you also need to consider the ways in which phenomenology can come up short, and to build that into your philosophy as well. And so just to sort of take all phenomenological experiences at face value, I think is a mistake that has been made in the past, and that philosophers can definitely integrate. So I think there's scores of really valuable ways in which philosophers and psychologists and neuroscientists and physicists can cross-pollinate.
And then finally, Jonathan, is the hard problem of consciousness a true scientific puzzle, a linguistic mix-up, or something else entirely? And
I
would
yeah.
add, and how would Meta Lab approach this?
Yeah. So I think that the first thing about the hard problem of consciousness is that it invites us to think about alternative perspectives about the nature of consciousness and its relationship to physical reality. And David Chalmers, when he sort of first introduced it, and sort of made the point that that it's possible that you can have a philosophical zombie that was exactly like us, but not conscious. And so that really sort of raises the question of what is consciousness. I mean, that just becomes all the more pressing as we think about AI, which is, people say, well, that's impossible. You wouldn't have philosophical zombies. But I think that the possibility of a philosophical zombie that is an intelligent being that acts conscious but isn't, is really becoming increasingly plausible. So the hard problem of consciousness invites us to think about different ontologies that might be ways of thinking about the nature of physical reality. And our approach, or at least one approach that we've taken in the lab, is to imagine this additional dimension of physical reality, the subjective dimension, as being sort of a key added element, which is what David Chalmers was suggesting was going to be required. And with Tam Hunt, we've also been thinking about sort of electromagnetic fields as potentially being a really a key aspect to sort of where consciousness is in physical reality. So I think the hard problem of consciousness, which of course had other terms for it before Chalmers, it's really also the mind-body problem. It's the explanatory gap. The idea's been with us for a long time. I think it's a real issue. It's a meaningful issue, and it's one that deserves our attention. Anil Seth would have us just sweep it under the rug as being just sort of a distraction. And I'm all for the kinds of questions that Anil is interested in with respect to predictive coding and so on. But I think to then dismiss the fundamental ontologies or just take them for granted, he just has decided material reductionism with biology. I think that it's premature to take that particular stance, although I greatly respect his perspectives.
Well, Jonathan, your work's incredible, man. So it's been such a pleasure and a highlight. You're the first conversation I've had for this year on Mind Body Solutions. So thank you for joining me today.
Well, thanks for inviting. Great questions, and I just hope that your listeners just take everything I say with a grain of salt, and just take their curiosity and explore ideas and push things forward, but always, like you said, keep that skepticism and that open mind.
Yeah, Jonathan, before we close, is there anything about all your work, whether it's mind wandering, etc., that you feel you haven't touched on that you'd like to close off on? Anything in particular you feel you haven't elaborated enough on? Feel free.
Well, what I would say is that right now, I think that the world is in a really important turning point where it needs to find ways of tolerating alternative perspectives. And we see this both in the polarization in the political world and in the intolerance in the scientific community for ontologies other than the prevailing scientism, material reductionist perspective. And I feel that cultivating openness is really just so important at this time, both from a political perspective, from a tolerance perspective, from a scientific perspective, from a philosophical perspective. And if there was sort of one thing I wish I could sort of offer humanity, it would be to create the incentive to become more open, more accepting of alternative, entertaining at least alternative perspectives, appreciating that even if something doesn't land with you, that it's an idea worth listening to. And that basic perspective, I think, could go so far to helping humanity turn this corner, showing greater respect for alternative perspectives and ultimately its own survival.